There's a bit of a GCD crisis going on in the BFA Alpha. So many acronyms, one almost can't even keep up with everything that's going on. Oh, by the way, my name is Luxeley. How are you guys doing? I don't think that this is something where people should be in an uproar. I'm actually siding with Blizzard on this in the sense of people give it a shot, but let's really look and see and ask a few questions here, because I think I can shed a very unique perspective on this. Because anytime I evaluate a new feature, in other words, a feature that they might be introducing in a new X pack or maybe in a new patch, or anytime they make a change to an existing feature, like they're doing with the Global Cooldown currently in the BFA Alpha, I look at things in three different ways and I ask three different questions. I always do this. One, is it good for the player? Two, is it good for Blizzard? And three, is it good for the game? For the player, it's about fun. Players are going to continue playing the game based on basically one thing, whether or not it's fun. Now, fun is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a very subjective thing. Some players might be into pet battles, other players might be into mythic raiding, mythic dungeons, PvP, competitive, non-competitive. So many different things, so many different subjective thoughts about fun. And I'd like you guys to leave in the comments what you find most fun about World of Warcraft. And if you don't find anything fun about World of Warcraft currently, think of the past. Think about what it was that you enjoyed doing most, whether it was Kata, Vanilla, Mists of Pandaria, it doesn't matter. I want you guys also to take a look at what other people are saying in the comments, because you're going to see a lot of different answers here when it comes to what is fun for a player in the game. Now, asking that same question from Blizzard's perspective is very different. Blizzard is most concerned about ROA, which is return on assets. Well, what exactly does that mean? Whenever Blizzard is putting together a new game, a new X pack, a new patch, it costs money to do. And that money is a combination of upgrading technology, programming, man hours, which encapsulate marketing, and to a large extent, even artwork. The concept stage of things. There's storytellers and being consistent with the lore, and a lot of things go into play. A lot of man hours go into creating these X packs. Blizzard wants to make sure that they're going to make more money than they put into it, especially when it comes to World of Warcraft, because you have to keep in mind, this is a game with a game engine that is over 100 years old in dog years, basically. That game engine goes back to the alpha. Now, yes, there have been changes over the years with each X pack, but the game engine is still very limiting when you compare it to other MMOs, particularly Guild Wars 2, SWTOR, most of those newer MMOs. Basically, any MMO that you could pull out of a hat that has somewhat of an audience has a more modern, upgraded type of game engine. There's a lot of things that Blizzard, I'm sure, would like to do, but they can't do. And even if they wanted to do it, even if they wanted to go through the changes that they have to make to the game engine and then all the programming changes, etc., it might not exactly be worth it because the game engine is so old. Picture this. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say you have a car and its book value is $2K. And let's say that car is 15, 16 years old, around the same age as the game engine here. And your transmission goes. And it's going to cost you $3 grand to fix the transmission, but the book value on the car is only $2 grand. Do you see the problem here? This is a question that Blizzard consistently asks themselves because they don't want to put a lot of money into WoW because it's a very old game engine. And eventually I think you are going to see WoW 2. I don't know when that's going to happen. Could happen 10 years from now, but I do believe eventually something like that's going to happen. That's why they diversified their portfolio, introduced Overwatch, Hearthstone, Heroes of the Storm, and now they're implementing Classic WoW. So Blizzard is most concerned with return on assets. Now, maybe in the past they put more emphasis on fun before the Activision merger. I would venture to say yes, they did. They listened to the community more. They were more in tune with what the community was saying, what the community wanted. And the whole concept of an MMO started with feedback from the community. And it was almost like the community dictated what the game would be. This concept is still there, but in reality is not followed by Blizzard. Certainly not as much as they did back in BC or Vanilla, which is what pisses off a lot of players. And the last question I always ask, and this could very well be the most important of the three questions, is this new feature or change to an existing feature good for the game? What does good for the game mean? Good for the game means, will it add to the longevity of the game? Will it add to the flavor of the game? And I think that there needs to be a balance when you ask this question. A balance between pleasing existing longtime fans. You want to please these people. You want to please these people with the lore, with the way the game plays, the amount of content, the quality of the content. But you also want to add new features in and change things around so you could bring in new players. You want to bring in those new players. Because if you don't consistently bring in new players, the game is going to erode, and Blizzard's going to put less and less assets into World of Warcraft, and assets meaning programmers, art people, and they're going to move on to other games. We've already seen this happening. We've already seen Blizzard diversify their portfolio. They could have taken that money that they used to develop Overwatch, Hearthstone, and Heroes of the Storm. They could have taken that money, and they could have used it to upgrade WoW 2 with a real game engine that's in this century. They could have done that. They chose not to. They chose to diversify. I'm not questioning their decision. From a business standpoint, it's probably wise to diversify. It's probably the right thing. But from the player's standpoint, I think they might have wanted something different. So there needs to be a good mix between, is this good for the game, the longevity of the game? Is it pleasing the existing fan base? And is it going to bring in new players? I'm going to use an old feature which was introduced in Burning Crusade, flying. And we're going to apply each of these three questions to it. For example, was flying good for the players? And the answer is pretty much yes, it really was. Players were very excited to have a different perspective of the game, to feel like they were bigger than the game, to rise above the game, to have that convenience to go from point A to point B, avoid potential world PvP, avoid anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 NPCs chomping at your heels while you're on a ground mount. And it just made things go a lot faster and a lot smoother when you were trying to quest. I mean, think of questing initially in the Broken Isles without flying as opposed to questing in Broken Isles with flying. So you see the point. Players love it. It's a good thing for the players. Is flying good for Blizzard? Was flying good for Blizzard? It was kind of a non-event for Blizzard. I don't think the good or the bad really started to come into play until many years later. For example, the good, Blizzard could sell flying mounts in the Blizz store. They could use the whole lore of flying mounts into the game. They could have a gold sync with different flying speeds. So yes, in that respect, it was good for Blizzard. How was it bad for Blizzard? Well, Ian Has a Clueless did say towards the end of Warlords of Draenor, the fun, that they were having difficulty implementing flying because of the garrison and other things, other technical difficulties, which is what really led to the delay in flying and the whole have to grind out your flying in order to be able to fly in Warlords of Draenor, the fun. In that respect, not good for Blizzard, but that's probably an isolated incident that isn't going to happen again. Now, the last question, is it good for the game? Is it good for the longevity of the game? If I asked that question when Burning Crusade first came out, or even Wrath of the Lich King, flying was a new thing. Flying was a big selling feature. Flying offered a very different perspective and different experience in game. It was great for the game. But as time went on, and flying started to become normalized and taken for granted, I think a lot of the majesty in the game kind of got diluted. And I think the whole grandioseness of the game kind of got diluted. And players started to feel bigger than the world, bigger than the game, and that took away from the overall immersion of the world that is World of Warcraft. That's my opinion. I know people will fight tooth and nail to the death that I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a right or wrong here. But when you look at it from the perspective, is this good for the game? I think losing those things is not a good trade-off for convenience or moving quicker or getting things done quicker. But that also is a matter of opinion. To hammer home this point, think of flying over the Grand Canyon and you look down from 5,000 or 10,000 feet. Doesn't really look that incredible. But if you're ground level, eye level, and you look out, it has depth, it has soul, it has spirit, and it sucks you in. And I think that's one big thing that's missing in World of Warcraft right now, and that's largely due to flying. Am I saying get rid of flying? Absolutely not. This is something that you can't the cow's been milked. You can't put the milk back in the udder. It just, you can't do it. You can't take this away from players. What is the global cooldown? That's the question. We're going to get into that. Next question, an even better question. How will these changes in BFA to the global cooldown affect combat, particularly gameplay in general? And then the last question, which I think is the best of the three questions we have to ask, is why is Blizzard doing this? What is their motivation? First, a brief history lesson about GCD and a definition, because I think it's going to really help us understand what's going on here. The history. Back in Vanilla WoW, everything was on the global cooldown. Everything, including interrupts. Think of how problematic that was. As time went on, Blizzard started taking things off of the GCD. Interrupts, unused trinkets, certain offensive and defensive buffs. As a result, gameplay got a bit faster, damage in some cases with some classes got a bit burstier, and things kind of worked a bit more fluid for certain classes as well, probably for most classes across the board. So here's what Blizzard is planning to change or proposing to change. We don't know if this is going through in full or in part. We don't know yet, but they're keeping interrupts off the global cooldown. If they put interrupts on the global cooldown, this game is going to suck. So at least they're not putting interrupts on the global cooldown. They're taking unused trinkets and buffs, not all buffs, but certain buffs and defenses, and they are basically putting them on the global cooldown. Now, how is this going to affect players? How is this going to affect the gameplay? Well, first and foremost, it is going to slow things down. Second, it's going to mitigate burst damage, especially in PvP, because you're not going to be able to readily stack your buffs with your trinkets. And also, that differential between classes that are burst type of DPS and classes that are sustain type of DPS, that gap between the two is going to get narrowed a bit. It's not going to be a significant narrowing of the gap, but it's going to be a noticeable narrowing of the gap. The third thing you're going to do is you're going to see the animations. Now, this is probably not a big thing for PvE, or is it? More on that in a second. But it's going to be a bigger thing in PvP. The animations can telegraph what a player's doing. And if you're going to add another second to it, people are going to pick up on this a lot quicker, a lot more readily, and they're going to pay attention to it more. And let me give you an analogy what this difference is. And I have to use this analogy. My European friends aren't going to get this, but this is the best analogy I could come up with. Think of a baseball game. Think of a pitcher and a batter. Now, the pitcher has a repertoire of pitches. Usually it comes down to fastball or curveball. And the hitter doesn't have a lot of time to react because that fastball is coming in at 95 miles an hour. Part of his gameplay is anticipation. If you take away that anticipation from the batter, and let's say the batter now knows it's going to be a fastball or it's going to be a curveball, still difficult to hit a 95 mile an hour fastball, but the fact that that pitch is being telegraphed is going to change things up quite a bit. And that's what's happening here when you add that extra second by basically putting some of these abilities back on the global cooldown like they were way back in the time. Is this good for the player? Is this good for the game? Is this good for Blizzard? Is it good for the player? Well, it depends on what spec and class you play. I would say if you play Melee, things are going to feel a lot less fluid, actually, and it's going to take some getting used to, or it might be something you don't get used to. It all depends on the spec. But you have to also keep in mind that just like a rising tide will lift all boats, a low tide will help bring them back down to earth. So this is affecting everyone. It is a global change of the global cooldown across the board. So if you are playing Melee and you're thinking this is going to suck, well, it's also going to affect ranged classes, ranged DPS, but not quite as much. Now, the next question is this good for Blizzard? Well, this is kind of a non-event for Blizzard, or is it? More on that in a few seconds. You got to ask yourself, is this good for the game? I could say yes, I could say no. I could say yes, it's good for the game because it's bringing the game back to a time that a lot of people love, which is vanilla to some extent, and it's also slowing things down a little bit, but it's kind of like a pendulum. If you look back at Warlords of Draenor, the fun, it was a Melee favored X-Pack. If you look back at Legion, it was a heavily melee favored X-Pack. If you look at MOP, it was a range DPS or a caster favored X-Pack. I don't like that this pendulum keeps swinging. And if this is Blizzard's motivation to change it back to a caster-oriented type of game, I don't like that. I want things to be fair across the board. So I'm not going to sit here, even though I prefer playing range DPS, this is probably going to benefit me. I don't think it's good for the game to keep changing things up like this. But the question is this good for Blizzard? And this is where I'm going to get to things, because I think this is why Blizzard might be doing this. And it has everything to do with the Mythic Dungeon Invitational and promoting Arena as an esport, because this is going to affect those two quite drastically. That extra second is enough not only to telegraph what's happening to other players, like in PvP, but to the spectators. This might make World of Warcraft more of a watchable game for spectators, because it's slowing down a little bit. Players are going to see the animations, they're going to appreciate the animations. That might not be for everyone, but I think that that's where the intent lies here. And like I said before, rising tide lifts all boats, and a low tide drops them down to Earth level as well. So it's going to affect everybody globally, so it's not going to be as drastic as people think it is. How's this going to change gameplay overall, generally speaking? It's going to slow things down quite a bit. Some classes are going to feel a bit clunky. Others are going to feel better. And it's going to feel different in PvP than it is in PvE. If you really think of the overall picture of what BFA combat's going to look like, now it just changed significantly with these changes to the global cooldown. But there's more. There's no artifacts, meaning your active abilities, your passive abilities. There's no legendaries, active and passive once again. And all this means that they really probably should have did more class overhauls than they actually did. This could make for very clunky gameplay and very murky gameplay across the board, or maybe not. We'll see. But I just had to throw that out there. Now, to really see how a global cooldown might affect the game, for those of you who play Final Fantasy and you're leveling up, from what I understand, that global cooldown between abilities is almost 2 seconds. The game is very, very slow. Now, as you gain talents and gain levels, that global cooldown starts to lessen, and the game feels a lot more fluid for most classes, actually the majority of classes, and it's more at par with the way WoW is now. Now, if you look at something like Guild Wars 2, where basically the global cooldown doesn't exist, and it's a really cool thing for PvE, but for PvP, it really takes away from the game. If there was a global cooldown in PvP in Guild Wars 2, I would not play WoW ever again. But Guild Wars 2 just moves too fast to evaluate and to decide what you have to do. It is 100% instinct. And, you know, I'm an older guy. I'm an older player. I'm not in high school. I'm not in college where the reflexes are a lot faster. So it does have an effect on me as a player. And I think it does hurt the game overall when there's absolutely no global cooldown on the PvP side, like in Guild Wars 2. I mentioned this before. I want to mention it again, hammer the point home, that the differential between burst and sustained DPS, particularly in raids, that gap is still going to be there. It's not going to be significantly changed, but it's going to be noticeably changed. So right now, there's a lot of people in an uproar about this. Casters, DPS casters, range players aren't exactly cheering it, although I sort of am. Melee players absolutely hate it across the board. Ian has a clueless, even went as far as to say STFU until you guys try this out and really kick the tires and work it and see how it is before you criticize it. I think I have to serve as reinforcements for Ian has a clueless on this, because I have faith in the guy. I don't have faith in any other developer at Blizzard, to be quite frank with everyone out there. But when it comes to Ian has a clueless, the guy has vision, the guy is very straightforward, the guy has passion for the game, and he might not come up with a lot of great ideas, but he is pretty good at recognizing great ideas. I think he's pretty good. And maybe he's right. We got to give this a shot. But nonetheless, you can't completely discount what's going on in the community. The community is very, very polarized right now. And anytime a community is polarized, the best thing is the word compromise. So I have two potential solutions here. Are they going to work? Is it an easy fix? Is it a layup fix? Maybe, maybe not. I don't really know. But at least I think I'm leading discussion in the right direction, down the right path. Plan A, you take heroism, you take bloodlust. Maybe you bump up the cooldown by 30 seconds or a minute. Maybe you don't. You got to play it out. I want to throw that out there. They have the same effects as they do now. You get that haste buff. But what it also does is it takes everything off the global cooldown for the duration of bloodlust or heroism. This is pretty interesting, I think, because when people hit bloodlust or heroism, you know it. You know it. It's something you're attuned to. It's something that is telegraphed. Maybe you could even add a visual to it. And I think this would add a really dynamic element to the game because you're going to have a very, not a very slow, but a slower style of play when you're out of bloodlust. And then when you hit it, you are really hitting the gas pedal. And I think it's going to demonstrate what it means to shift gears like we've never seen before. From slow to fast, from going the speed limit by a school, 20 miles an hour, to the Autobahn. I think that's really exciting. Maybe some changes need to be made. Maybe this is an idea that people could build on. But I think it's a pretty good compromise for those that are very upset by this and the people that kind of like it, which I think there's about 5 or 6. So that's one potential solution. That's plan A. Plan B, you have 2 different types of gameplay for PvP and PvE. Because overall, I think this is a very good thing for PvP going forward, but I think it's a bad thing for PvE going forward. So you don't really change anything when it comes to PvE. Everything stays the same, everything's status quo. But when it comes to PvP, you implement this. And this is the style of play you go with. Those are just my thoughts. Those are just some potential solutions. And I think both of those solutions are very workable. I think you would add a visualization to plan A. And I think just those shifts in gear is going to be amazing. I think it's going to add for a really unique, dynamic type of gameplay like WoW's never seen before. And then plan B, 2 different types of gameplay. Sounds kind of crazy when you first hear it, but when you really think about it, it can be done. I mean, if they could have scaling gear when you go from regular combat to PvP combat, I think they can implement a different type of global cooldown. So, I don't know. You know, I'm just looking for a solution. And sometimes you got to toss ideas out there, take a risk, and have people create some discussion. Maybe they make things better. Maybe they shoot it down with some good evidence and some hard facts. And I'm open to both. But the bottom line is, I do stand by this. When there's polarization, compromise is the best way to go. So maybe we don't go full throttle like Ian Has a Clueless wants us to go, but maybe status quo isn't the answer either. This is Luxeley saying, whatever it is by you, whether it's morning, afternoon, or night, make it epic. It's the moment that counts.